The People of the Secret. Chapter 5. Love Courts, Troubadours and Round Tables. Between 1000 and 1300, the wandering minstrel declaimed his poems and sang his haunting songs of love round the ducal courts of Provence. His apprentice or joggler played the viol, and the music they made and the ideas they spread abroad have been reverberating through Europe ever since, crystallizing in psychological ideas and literary forms unrecognizably remote from the origins. There would seem to be no possible connection between the songs of Guillaume, Count of Poitiers in the 12th century, and modern university-sponsored excavations at Cadbury and Glastonbury in 1970, but we hope to show that there is a connection. For the legends of Arthur and the 20th century search for his origins alike connect back to a something which manifested historically as the troubadour phenomenon. The troubadours were a mystery, even in their own day. The movement apparently sprang from nowhere, without seeming ancestry, and when it appeared it was ready-made in its final form. Superficially, it was an entirely local and somewhat aberrated conceit among minor princelings and effete aristocrats who, like Jack Point, sighed for the love of a lady. Though seemingly the concern of the wealthy and the leisured, it nevertheless had scullions and kitchen maids in its ranks. But whatever the rank of the lady fair, the subtending idea was the same. She was unattainable, and her suitor's love was hopeless. Significantly, the lady was unobtainable even at ordinary level, for she was not a maid, but a married woman. Strangely enough, her husband did not seem to regard the suitor as an enemy or even a rival. Something of this strange and unnatural situation is to be found implicit in Arthurian material, where the reader finds it impossible to discover where his allegiance is supposed to lie. Lancelot is Guinevere's lover. She is Arthur's dutiful queen. Arthur is a hero king. In the circumstances, the reader feels that Lancelot ought to be presented as worthy of the reader's moral disapproval. Instead, all three elements are presented as equally worthy. In such a typically troubadour ménage à trois, much of significance is symbolized. The alchemical content is suggested in relation to King Mark, Tristan, and Isolde by the alchemist Fulcanelli. Thus, let us note that the queen is the wife both of the old man and of the young hero. This is in accordance with the Hermetic tradition, which makes the king, the queen, and the lover combine to form the mineral triad of the great work. How did such an idea originate, and where did it come from? In the light of documents which emerged in Spain after the Second World War, and of some hints released more recently from the East, there seems little doubt that the troubadours were one more social experiment of the Sufi schools operating from Spain. Like most Sufi experiments, its derivation is carefully obscured. Like most such experiments, it was concerned to operate by manipulating environment so as to effect a change in a small selected section of a population. Over the century and a half during which it was active, the troubadour movement achieved a refinement of life and a standard of culture which probably went unequaled for 500 years. When the operation withdrew, Provençal culture reverted to a level which historians do not hesitate to describe as barbarism. It seems possible to detect a number of aims behind the troubadour movement. The first was to suggest by a subtle symbolism the existence of a kind of love which could not be realized in human terms. The Sufis believe that within mankind there is an element activated by love which provides the means of attaining to true reality. Secondly, perhaps, the reinstatement of a passive, recessive feminine element into the stream of European life. This element was primary in the Great Mother impulse and has probably been defective in the entire history of the West. Whether the ingrafting of the cult of the Virgin into Christianity was part of the intention, or whether this crept into dogma by osmosis from the troubadour impulse, it is impossible to say. Most likely the cult of the Virgin was adopted into Christianity on the well-known principle, if you cannot beat them, join them. It is certainly remarkable, as Robert Graves has pointed out, that her greatest veneration today is in those parts of Europe that fell strongly under Sufic influence. The theory of the Sufic origin of the troubadours has been strengthened in academic circles by the discovery in Spain of bilingual troubadour songs in Arabic and Catalan, and Roger Loomis points to similarities between Moorish poetry in Spain and troubadour poetry in Provence. such as the curious custom of addressing the worshipful mistress as my lord, Provençal midon. Loomis also refers to the work of Ibn Hazm, The Dove's Neck Ring, which he says might be regarded as a textbook on the courtly love of the troubadours. In Ibn Hazm's book, the influence of love is described as making a stingy one generous, a gloomy one bright-faced, a coward brave, a curmudgeon gay, and an ignoramus clever. It seems clear that the Provençal love poetry originated in Moorish Spain and was brought to Provence by Spaniards speaking both Arabic and the Catalan dialect. This was almost identical with Provençal, the langue d'oc of southern France. The word troubadour is usually held to derive from the Provençal verb troubar, to find or invent. But Idries Shah has shown that the derivation is from the Arabic root trb, with the agental suffix ador added. This trb root involves a play on words characteristic of Sufic thinking. The range of words that can be built on this consonantal root includes a meeting place of friends, a master, playing the viol, and the idealization of women. Sufi schools mounting an operation choose their terminology and their codes with great care, selecting a title whose root consonants will permutate to suggest words covering as many of their proposed activities as possible. It can hardly be denied that the TRB permutations cover the known attributes and activities of the troubadours. The most characteristic feature of the troubadour love poetry, on which the whole concept of courtly love and later of chivalry rested, was the idealization of woman. She was the poet's ideal mistress, whom he worshipped from afar, without, however, any hope of obtaining her favor, or so it would seem, viewed externally. Much of it between the lines was thinly disguised metaphysics, with unattainable princesses used to symbolize a spiritual quality to which man might feel drawn, but which was essentially unattainable in his ordinary state. The songs followed a set pattern of statement and refrain, the result giving a monotony which is the subject of much literary criticism. Lewis Spence comments on the monotonous repetition of amatory sentiment for the expression of which the same conceptions and even the same phrases are compelled again and again to do duty. This is certainly a defect if judgment is on aesthetic grounds, but the matter may take on another appearance if we suspect that the troubadours, after the pattern of the Sufic schools of Spain, were communities meeting under a master for a specific purpose and choosing to operate through the medium of poetry readings, accompanied by the viol and lute. If there is a secondary meaning to the poetry, if it was in fact in code, the monotony may not be an inadvertent defect at all. The first historical troubadour of the West was Guillaume, 7th Count of Poitiers and 9th Duke of Aquitaine, 1071 to 1127. He was the grandfather of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a lady of unusual talents and a marked capacity for survival, whose influence on later events, historical, cultural, and literary, is quite astonishing. Guillaume had been a crusader in the East. He had also fought in Andalusia, where, presumably, he made contact with the troubadour operation at its inception. He was soon in conflict with the church because his songs were held to be overtly, and therefore scandalously, sexual. Friedrich here, however, senses the concealed mysticism. In Guillaume's love songs, the vocabulary and emotional fervor hitherto used to express man's love for God are transferred to the liturgical worship of women. One is tempted to add, and vice versa. Guillaume provided the talent initially, but it was left to his granddaughter Eleanor to build up what might be called the theatrical circuit. She created a network of minor courts, round which the troubadours circulated, and within which the highly stylized concepts of courtly love and chivalry rapidly developed. Eleanor was the richest heiress in Europe, with lands stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees, from the Auvergne to the Atlantic. At the core was Provence, where she spent her childhood. With such possessions, she was thought a fitting match for Louis VII of France, whom she married in 1137. Louis had never expected to be king and had been educated as a monk, but the death of his elder brother put him unexpectedly on the throne of France. Temperamentally, he was excessively unsuited to the mercurial and passionate Eleanor. "I thought," said Eleanor later, "to have married a king, but find I am wed to a monk." In 1146, Louis went off on the Second Crusade, taking his wife with him. Contrary to the papal bull on the subject, she insisted on taking her troubadours with her. The Crusaders, when they reached Syria, halted at Antioch, and there Eleanor found an environment truly suited to her temperament. Antioch at the time was one of these princeling states which had grown up after a local conquest by the Crusaders, who instead of returning home, preferred to settle in the exotic surroundings of their conquest. The ruler of Antioch was Raymond, who was Eleanor's uncle. His court, over which he presided in great style, included Christians, Muslims, and Greeks. Some of the original Crusader conquerors had married Saracen women, and the second generation were more than half Muslim in their ways. The exotic atmosphere and the luxury in Raymond's court appealed greatly to Eleanor, who may well have known a family tradition in such matters from her grandfather, who had obviously had Arabic, if not Sufic, contacts in Syria or Spain. Indifferent to the scandal, Eleanor decided to remain in Antioch with her uncle and let her husband go back to France alone. Louis, in spite of his scholarly temperament, was made of sterner stuff and promptly set off for home, taking his wife with him by force. This was an action which had far-reaching effects indeed, leading as it did to the transmission of certain influences like the orders of chivalry into England. Indignant perhaps at her husband's treatment of her, Eleanor on her return to France proceeded to have her marriage dissolved. This formality completed, she married Henry, son of Geoffrey of Anjou, who was shortly to become King of England. The early years of her second marriage were spent at Angers, which rapidly became a resort of troubadours and an academy of the cult of courtly love. Here, Bernard de Ventadour wrote his love poetry in her honor. In 1154, Henry and Eleanor were crowned King and Queen of England, but it quickly became apparent that neither her second husband nor the English climate was agreeable to Eleanor. When Henry, who was 12 years her junior, took as his mistress Rosamond Clifford, subject of the ballad of Fair Rosamond, Eleanor withdrew to Poitiers, where she devoted her entire resources to developing the love court in its final form. Poitiers became a university of courtesy, troubadour poetry, and chivalry, an academy of the courtly arts to which the nobility from far and near came for instruction. Several future kings and queens and many future dukes and duchesses were educated in Eleanor's campus and returned home to model their own courts on hers. Thus, the courtly ideal and the lyrical love poetry were distributed over Europe, together with whatever was secretly contained in these forms. At Poitiers, courtiers were tried to decide whether they had kept the 31 articles of the Code of Love laid down in the De Arte Honest Amandi, compiled by Andreas Capellanus. One of the chief judges was Marie, Countess of Champagne, Eleanor's daughter. In all this apparently weird activity, a subversive element was undoubted. Love court judgments were always subtly subversive of the social order. Troubadour songs were openly subversive of the papal authority. The troubadours and the love courtiers, like the jesters of the time, who were undoubted Sufi figures, claimed license to criticize matters which were by common consent regarded as taboo. Obviously something was going on. It would be tempting to equate or at least associate this something with the Albigensian heresy, but it would probably be wrong to do so. A study of such Sufic interventions as can be suspected from their outward effects suggests that a Sufic operation is frequently in existence simultaneously with an official heresy, but is never part of it. It may be significant, however, that the troubadour and love court phenomenon almost exactly spans the period of the Albigensian heresy. The troubadour movement was greatly reduced by the siege of Toulouse in 1218 and the Treaty of Paris in 1299. It was virtually extinguished by the expanding powers of the Inquisition in the early 1300s. Catharism, the Albigensian heresy, came from the East and was apparently rooted in Greek Gnosticism and 4th-century Persian Manichaeism. It first appeared in Western Europe about 1140. And in 2 years gained a hold in the region between the Rhine and the Pyrenees. It had a widespread organization with its own clergy, bishops, and international councils. The most important bishopric was at Albi in southern France, which gave the movement its name Albigensian. In Languedoc and Provence, it flourished alongside the court culture of the troubadours. Catharism enjoyed much aristocratic patronage, especially that of Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. It had a great appeal for women and numbered many nuns of noble birth among its supporters. The appeal was perhaps from the fact that women as well as men could become Cathars or pure ones. Its appeal among ordinary people may have sprung from the fact that they could participate, Cathar literature being in the vernacular. The Albigensian mystery is largely unresolved to this day. The Cathar massacres were so complete that almost nothing of their beliefs survived. What little is known comes from their enemies. They were certainly remorselessly hostile to the Church of Rome, which they believed had succumbed to the lust of gold and power at the time of Constantine and had ruled in unholy alliance with the princes of the world ever since. The Cathars were said to believe that Satan had created the human race. He was a son of God, but was essentially hostile to man. Another son of God now had the task of redeeming the situation. Against the rigid dogma of the 11th and 12th centuries, this was seen as a transparent attempt to elevate the status of Satan. The belief seems strangely like the expression of some racial memory concerned with the events which we have interpreted in terms of the demiurgic revolt. In many respects, Cathar ritual reflected the practices of the early pre-Constantine Church. There might also be a link with a common ancestor of Freemasonry in that the Cathar candidate was addressed as a living stone in the temple of God. Catharism was clearly a threat to Rome, and when various missionary attempts were repulsed, Innocent III appealed to the faithful to stamp out the abomination. A crusade was preached by the Cistercians, and an inflammable situation rapidly turned into a French civil war between North and South. The war ended officially with the surrender of Raymond VII, which meant the defeat of the entire South. As soon as the Albigensians were crushed in the field, the Inquisition was set up at Toulouse, and many heretics were burned at the stake. In 1244, at Montségur, 200 men, women and children were burned alive in a single day. The Cathars survived in Germany, in Cologne, Strasbourg, Erfurt and Goslar for some time to come. Another stream of refugees went to Italy, where there were sympathizers in Florence. Others went to Liguria and Sicily. The Troubadours as such were not persecuted, but with the collapse of the ducal courts in the south of France, the environment in which they worked was destroyed. The last of the Troubadours is said to have been Guiraud Riquier, a native of Narbonne who lived until 1294 as a refugee at the court of Alfonso X in Spain. It seems that a Sufic operation designed to inject a developmental impulse into a certain population at a certain time may run parallel to, but always separate from, an official religion. The same mistletoe relationship may apply to an official heresy. If the troubadour and courtly love medium was a local and minor instrument of the directorate, it may be presumed that European events for a century and a half would fall well within the present moment of those directly responsible. If so, the destruction of the Albigensians, the oak beside which the mistletoe grew, would certainly be foreseen. Such operations as we are suggesting are characterized by a certain finality. They operate on a selected group for a particular purpose and for a certain time only. The impulse is then wholly withdrawn. So penetrating is the energy involved, however, that harmonics of the original excitation may continue for centuries. For the most part, it is only such echoes that are detectable, and it is these that are investigated historically. In the matter of the Troubadours, it is possible that the original operation, which was extremely local, was transferred to a larger octave so as to encompass the whole of Europe. It is at any rate clear that the courtly love and chivalric ideal, which had produced such marked refinement in human conduct, did not expire with the destruction of the Albigenses. It might almost seem that when the Albigensian persecution was imminent, the impulse was transferred to a new carrier wave, this time accented on a combined military and astrological theme, the Arthurian legend. We suggest that the Arthurian legend was deliberately developed for this purpose. But to glimpse this, we must return to Eleanor and her many activities. Evidence of initiatory influences in her family has recently been given by Idries Shah. Eleanor's favorite son, Richard, was the famous Coeur de Lion. In Arabic, Coeur de Lion would be Qalb el-Nimr. This contains two Sufic initiatory words. Qalb, heart, comes from the QLB root, which spreads to give essence or vital portion. Lion has a secondary significance as man of the way, a familiar term for a Sufic aspirant on the way to higher development. Richard's nickname is thus an announcement to those who understand that he has been initiated. Since phraseology of this kind must also make sense at the literal as well as the esoteric level, he is also the lion-hearted, the bold and fearless warrior of the Crusades. The whole Plantagenet dynasty was deeply involved in hidden activity, and some of this echoes today in modern chivalric orders. Geoffrey of Anjou, Richard's grandfather, had a shield showing golden lions on a field of blue, a combination which would be recognized even by a modern alchemist as a statement to a certain effect. Geoffrey's father, Fulk V, was king of Jerusalem and a great friend of the Saracen regent of Damascus. Geoffrey made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and visited his father, and it seems likely that his initiation took place at this time. Geoffrey adopted as his family emblem the broom plant, Planta genista, hence the Plantagenets. The French for broom is genet, which has almost the same sound as genet, the civet cat. Among relatively modern secret societies in Europe, one had the title Knights of the Genet, Chevalier de la Genette, and the 20th century alchemist Fulcanelli regards it as one having genuine initiatory knowledge. According to the Oxford Dictionary and other dictionaries, civet is derived from the Arabic zabad, civet cat. Did a similar sound shift serve to render zabad as az-zabat, forceful occasion in Arabic, and hence sabat? A closely associated word is zida, quintessence, main point, substance. Thus, the broom plant, the Plantagenets, a modern Hermetic society, the witch's broom and the sabbat may all have derived from a single event, the initiation of Geoffrey of Anjou, father-in-law of Eleanor of Aquitaine and grandfather of Richard Coeur de Lion. Richard's mother, Eleanor, outlived her husband after spending 15 years as his prisoner in Salisbury, and emerged to take over the government of England while Richard went off to the Third Crusade. There we find Coeur de Lion in a situation which makes little sense by ordinary standards, but is consistent with his hidden role. Things outwardly opposed may inwardly be working together, Rumi. He is fighting Saladin, his Saracen foe, but is at the same time on the best of terms with him. Saladin sends his personal physician to attend Richard when he is ill, and Richard is reported to have offered his own sister as a bride for Saladin's brother. Later, on his way home, he is imprisoned and passes his time composing troubadour poetry. It seems unlikely that Richard was the only member of the family with access to non-ordinary knowledge. His half-sister Marie, Countess of Champagne, Eleanor's daughter, was almost certainly knowledgeable, and it was probably through her that the move was made to translate the chivalric ideal from its local situation into a pan-European one. Material which is to be manipulated in a certain way for developmental effect is almost always constructed around actual people and actual events. In this case, the central figure was the Romano-British chieftain Arthur. Historians now grant the historicity of Arthur. He is held to have been a battle leader of Celtic tribes who, in the Gotterdammerung of the Roman departure from Britain, rallied the Celts and inflicted a major defeat on the invading Saxons at the Battle of Mount Badon, somewhere between Kent and Wiltshire. This battle is described by St. Gildas, writing 40 years after the event, but he does not mention Arthur. Arthur is first mentioned by name in the Historia Brittonum of Nennius, a Welsh cleric writing about the year 800. A colourful version of the Arthurian story was set down by Geoffrey of Monmouth in his Historia Regum Britanniae, written about 1135, and this was paraphrased in couplets by the French poet Wace in 1155. However, the legend had already reached the continent in advance of Geoffrey's version. From the Breton minstrels, and from the recitations of Bléhéres, an émigré Welshman who seems to have brought it independently to Poitiers. The temptation should perhaps be resisted to link the wandering Breton minstrels with their contemporaries the Troubadours, or with the 10th century Abu Ishaq Chisti, the Syrian founder of the Chisti order of Sufis, whose followers were the origin of the medieval court jesters of Europe, and we should regard the Breton minstrels rather as the descendants of the Irish Ollams or the Welsh bards. Professor Sir Hamilton Gibb notes that the author of one version of the Grail saga even mentions an Arabic book as his source. Yet even if we do not establish a direct Sufic influence, we cannot ignore the possibility of a stream parallel to the Sufic coming down from antiquity through the Celts, who, as we have seen in the case of the Celtic Church, preserved the imaginative and poetic side of the old tradition when it was in danger of dying out in the rest of Europe. It is perhaps because the Celts, through their comparative isolation from the rest of Europe, were still to some extent in touch with the old tradition that their legends were suitable for use as the basis of the new courtly romances by the Sufic element. Through the influence of Eleanor and her associates, these were diffused through northern France and into Britain. Friedrich Heer, whose insights in these matters are remarkable, says in The Medieval World, "In the great images of the Romans' courtois, two currents merged in a powerful confluence, the stream of material flowing into Western Europe from outside, our italics, during the 12th century, and the suppressed native springs of the Celtic and even more primitive cultures. As we have seen, the Arthurian material, or raw material, already existed at Poitiers from the penetration of the Breton minstrels, from the travels of Bleheris, and from Geoffrey of Monmouth's British History. The process of upgrading it to a world myth which would last for 1,000 years was ready to begin. The architect, it would seem, was Chrétien de Troyes, who was a courtier at Poitiers and a protégé of Eleanor's daughter, Marie. Chrétien used the Arthurian material, but he also cashed in on the popularity of a current verse form. This was the verse romance, dealing with what today would be called the French national spirit, but was then called the Matter of France. These verse romances, the most famous of which was the Chanson de Roland, commemorated the spirit of Charlemagne and the deeds of the paladins in their fight against the Moors. Popular in tone, these verse romances were recited by pilgrims or crusaders on the march. Chrétien turned the Arthur material into a matter of Britain. The suggestion that more than mere composition was involved here is made by Roger Sherman Loomis. A perusal leads inevitably to the conclusion that some powerful forces had been at work between the 11th and 13th centuries to transform Arthur from an insular into an international figure. Chrétien de Troyes, who began his literary career about 1170, wrote 5 Arthurian romances: Eric, Cleges, Lancelot, Yvain, and Percival. A distinct suggestion that Chrétien was working under orders is contained in Chrétien's own comment on Lancelot, which deals with the love of the knight Lancelot for Guinevere, Arthur's wife. He declares that he was given the scène, the controlling idea, from Marie of Champagne, thus showing the deliberate injection of the Provençal love theme of the Troubadours into the Arthurian medium. The basic plot of the 5th romance, Percival, was given to Chrétien by Philip of Flanders, who was Marie's second husband. This again suggests a policy move, for in Percival, for the first time, the story of the Grail is introduced. Percival is at the castle of the lame fisher king and is attending a banquet. Before each course, a procession passes through the hall, including a squire bearing a lance to which a drop of blood clings, and a maiden bearing a jewel-studded grail or bowl. Percival fails to ask the correct question: whom does one serve with the grail? And next morning finds the castle deserted. He then sets out in quest of the grail. Chrétien apparently died before completing Percival, and the grail mystery is therefore unsolved. Jesse Weston suggests that the grail and the lance were sexual symbols, and the ritual in the castle was an initiation rite. After Chrétien's death, the theme was taken up by other poets. 4 different sequels to Percival appeared, in one of which it is clear that a Christianizing process had already begun. Here the bleeding lance is identified with the spear of Longinus, which is said to have pierced the side of the crucified Christ, and the grail is identified with the vessel in which Joseph of Arimathea caught drops of blood. The Arthurian legend proceeded to spread like a self-multiplying organism. Versions of Chrétien's romances were made in Middle English, Middle High German, Dutch, and Old Norse. Between 1210 and 1233 long French prose romances, the prose Lancelot, the Quest of the Holy Grail, and the Morte d'Arthur were written, probably by monks, and combined in a Vulgate cycle, so called on account of the great popularity which the contents enjoyed with the common people. It seems clear that the value of the Arthur material, and the energy it contained, was sensed by the church. While the idealistic love theme is more or less intact in Lancelot in the Vulgate cycle, the other two are already being adapted to validate the celibate ideal which the church could endorse. The Vulgate cycle was the main source of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, printed by Caxton in 1485. And the Morte d'Arthur, in its turn, was the main source for Tennyson's Idylls of the King. As the original Chrétien de Troyes romances were spreading over Europe, a very remarkable coincidence can be observed in Britain. We have suggested that when certain legends are to be used to operate on human psychology in a certain way, historical figures and historical incidents are chosen as a basis. We may also suspect that validation of the historical facts is sometimes arranged. By a very strange coincidence, the bones of the historic Arthur just happened to come to light as Chrétiens. Arthur was catching the European imagination. A present-day journalist would recognize this event as precisely what was needed to keep the story going. Henry II is traveling in Wales and just happens to meet the one monk who knows where Arthur's grave is. It is at Glastonbury Abbey. Henry II, it will be recalled, was the husband of Eleanor, who has something like a family interest in translating the troubadour mystique into a new medium. The monks at Glastonbury start digging at the indicated spot and 7 feet down come upon a stone slab and a lead cross with the inscription Hic jacet sepultus in Clytus Rex Arturus in Insula Avalonia. Below, in a coffin made of a hollow log, is the skeleton of a very large man indeed. The medieval world accepted these relics as authentic, but the find has been regarded as a little too fortuitous by modern scholars who recall that genuine relics were the stock in trade of any medieval monastery which hoped to attract pilgrims and hence funds. Against this is one awkward fact. Hollow coffin burial is now known to correspond to a certain period. But it is thought that the Glastonbury monks would have had no way of knowing this in 1190. If they had been bent on faking a relic discovery for the greater glory of the abbey, they would much more probably have discovered Arthur in a container of stone. Against all customary usage, they discovered him in a hollowed-out log. One possible explanation has not so far been considered. Glastonbury is associated with an esoteric tradition. In the 10th century, St. Dunstan, who was born near Glastonbury, was educated by the Irish monks there, before entering the household of King Athelstan. Athelstan, through his nephew and his sisters, was connected with both the Frankish court and the Emperor Otto III. Sufic influences are known to have entered England at this time, and it is not at all improbable that Dunstan made contact with these influences. He was at any rate turned out of Athelstan's court for practicing the black arts. Dunstan then became a monk and lived as a hermit till recalled to court by Athelstan's successor, Edmund. In 943, Dunstan was made abbot of Glastonbury, and under him the monastery became a famous school with a high reputation for both music and geometry, subjects which had a particularly Arabic flavour at that time. Further, Dunstan is the patron saint of goldsmiths, which is a strange association unless gold has a secondary meaning. He is also reputed to have tweaked the devil's nose with his goldsmith's tongs. The matters associated with Dunstan's name have an inescapable flavour of alchemy, and legend says that the wonders performed by Dee and Kelly at the court of Elizabeth 600 years later were based on a quantity of philosopher's stone made by St. Dunstan, secreted in a hollow stone and recovered by Kelly's clairvoyance. It may be that a secret Sufic school operated at Glastonbury behind the cover of an orthodox monastery. If so, it is possible that the discovery of the mortal Arthur at Glastonbury and the creation of the psychological Arthur at Poitiers were two sides of the same operation. Sufic operations are notoriously economic, each component serving several purposes. Glastonbury Abbey had been burned down in 1184. Were Arthur's bones disinterred to attract pilgrim money for a rebuilding program, and at the same time to endorse the Arthurian legend abroad, currently becoming a vehicle of Sufic psychology? Love poetry and the Arthurian romances flourished in Germany at the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th centuries. Provençal poets had been received at the court of Frederick Barbarossa, and from 1180 onwards the German Minnesänger took up the medium on the Provençal model in Middle High German. These German poets were all members of the minor nobility. attached to the courts of rich patrons, the most famous of whom was the Landgraf Hermann of Thuringia. Among the most famous of the Minnesänger were Heinrich von Weldecker, Friedrich von Hausen, who died on the Third Crusade, Heinrich von Morungen, who journeyed to India, Reinmar von Hagenau, Hartmann von Auyi, and the father of German lyrical poetry, Walter von der Vogelweide. The Arthurian romance also appeared in new forms. Hartmann von Auer wrote a German version of Chrétien's Erich and Iwein, and between 1200 and 1210, Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote his masterpiece, Parzival. Here the Grail appears, not as a vessel, but as a stone. Permutations of the Arthurian legend continue into the 20th century. One of the most penetrating allegories in modern fiction, C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, is based on it. In this, an esoteric order of chivalry has continued to the present day, able to call on principalities and powers to further its support for the true West, over which Arthur in some mysterious way still rules. For Arthur did not die, but our Lord took him to be in the body till the end, with Enoch and Elias and Moses and Melchizedek the king. Melchizedek is he in whose hall the steep-stoned ring sparkles on the forefinger of the Pendragon. So compelling are the energies that surround Arthur that they can hypnotize Sir Winston Churchill into one of the most extraordinary statements ever made by an historian. Investigating the historic origins of the story, Sir Winston says, "If we could see exactly what happened, we should find ourselves in the presence of a theme as well-founded, as inspired and as inalienable from the inheritance of mankind as the Odyssey or the Old Testament. It is all true, or it ought to be." Our italics. Perhaps the most penetrating summary of the whole subject comes from Friedrich here. There can no longer be any doubt that the theme of the great romantic epics, in France extending from the work of Chrétien de Troyes to that of Renard de Beaujeu, in Germany from Hartmann van Auer to Wolfram van Eschenbach, is initiation, dedication, metamorphosis and absorption into a higher and fuller life, at once more human and more divine. All Arthurian romances of the first rank were attempts at expounding the process of man's interior development. Through his relationship with the woman, the man gains access to his own soul. Some 4 years before this present book was written, a group of 5 people of different nationalities came together because of a common interest in esoteric subjects. Each had a specialty interest in one branch of occult law. All of them had been convinced for some time that behind the various aspects of esotericism which they had studied piecemeal, there was some overall unity which eluded them. They began to suspect, from hints that had become increasingly explicit from the early 1950s, that the word Sufi pointed to the overall organization which they suspected but had not been able to identify. This group decided to pool resources and see if they could take this idea further. The group of 5 succeeded in making contact initially with one contemporary Sufic group and were allowed facilities for further investigation. The conditions under which they were allowed to investigate and the discoveries they made will be discussed later, but it is appropriate at this stage to look at one study which they originated. They approached a sociologist whose interest was European history and asked him to consider, purely as a theoretical exercise, the idea that certain movements in history were not fortuitous but directed. In effect, the idea of the secret people was presented to him as a purely hypothetical concept, and he was asked to try to analyze a number of historical incidents as though such an organization existed. The several historical occasions he was asked to study were in fact Sufic operations. His analysis is now given, and we have added in italics, after some of his conclusions, a possible relevance, taken either from the Troubadour Arthurian complex or from alchemy and associated subjects. His report was as follows. In all the periods studied, the incidents or events under review take place against similar backgrounds. A prevailing order claims, explicitly or implicitly, to have a monopoly of truth. In the past, such systems were either religious or national, but whatever the apparent form, the essential structure of such ideologies is essentially the same as that of modern totalitarian regimes. All such systems seek to indoctrinate their communities with a given set of beliefs, and the concept of heresy is a means of involving the population in the control apparatus. Each individual becomes the supervisor of his neighbor for the good of all. The good so served is, in fact, the good of the control apparatus itself. Assuming the existence of individuals and organizations concerned with breaking the monopoly of such rigid systems by conveying new knowledge into them, the given hypothesis, there would appear to be two main means possible. 1. The use of some advanced capacity, perhaps related to ESP, to communicate directly with selected members of the community. Even if such capacities exist, their employment would be difficult or impossible to identify in operation, and little more can be said about such a possibility. 2. A direct approach from within the community itself, through some center which was a. Hidden and therefore unsuspected by the organization in power. b. Operating openly but seemingly engaged in an activity wholly innocuous to the official regime. c. Apparently part of the official regime itself. The suggested historical groupings which fall under suspicion as being the subjects of such intervention exhibit certain characteristics in common, and it may therefore be possible tentatively to suggest the general procedures possibly employed by some postulated individuals and groups conducting such intervention. Characteristics of such interventions are: 1. They are said to be teachings. Freemasonry's rationale is supposed to be a teaching transmitted from ancient times. 2. They have a leadership. The Rosicrucians regard Christian Rosenkreuz as their spiritual head. The Grand Master was spiritual and temporal head of the Templars. St. Francis was the head of the Franciscans. 3. They use symbols or a language of their own. The Troubadour codes, the ciphers of alchemy, the strange medieval figures who spoke no Western language but held up symbols, the tools of Freemasonry, the symbol language of heraldry. 4. They are said to be for the benefit of mankind. The Knights Templars were to protect pilgrims. In recent times, there have been suggestions of an influence not explainable in terms of expediency or of either personal or national advantage, connected with the origins of the Red Cross. Baden-Powell's life attitude may have been decisively affected by his contact with the Regiment of Guides in the Second Afghan War. Much of the Scout and Wolf Cub symbolology has a transpersonal and transnational significance if investigated below its apparent surface triviality. 5. They stress secret knowledge or development by stages or degrees. Freemason and Rosicrucian secret societies are based on a degree structure allegedly marking, or at least symbolizing, advances in inner development. 6. They cross the ordinary boundaries of nation, race, and religion. Both the real and the ostensible activities of Raymond Lully exemplify this. Alchemy was international, and alchemists understood each other in spite of differences in race or language. Eleanor of Aquitaine's courts were attended by the young nobility of Europe. The translators converged on Spain from many countries and returned to distribute their material. 7. They are said to have come from outside or are connected with strangers or foreigners. The mystique of Freemasonry, the mystique of the Gypsies. Historians continue to try and trace some motivation behind the diaspora of the Gypsies in the 15th century, but find that what they are seeking eludes them. The possible simultaneous appearance of the tarot pack in Europe has, however, been noted, as has the phrase, the affairs of Egypt, the choice of Assyrian as the patron saint of England. 8. They have powerful sponsorship from important figures in the host community. Raymond of Toulouse for the Cathars, the family of Aquitaine for the Troubadours, the British royal families for the Orders of Chivalry, royal patronage for cathedral builders. 9. They require tests and practices for their operation. The signs and passwords of the Freemasons, the trade practices of workers in traditional crafts, and the rituals to which apprentices are subjected on obtaining the grade of journeyman. The word journeyman is almost overt in suggesting participation on a path. The trade test of an apprentice cooper to the present day has thinly veiled initiatory elements. 10. They have a myth or symbolical story, or stories whose parallels are believed to be worked out in the life of the community or group. The symbolology of Hiram Abif, the symbolology of the English coronation rite, the symbolology of Morris dancing, the order of knighthood based on Arthurian, chivalric symbolism. 11. They have unexpected links with each other, not explained by saying that heretics are attracted to one another, which is not in any case true. There is reason to suspect that much activity ordinarily assigned to well-known individuals is in fact the result of influences emanating from groups with which the individuals were associated. The tales of Wolfram von Eschenbach and Chrétien de Troyes, the poetry of Dante, Spencer, Blake and Goethe, the orders of chivalry, Zen Buddhism and Judo, the medicine of Paracelsus and the psychology of Mesmer, the devotional system of St. Francis and the disciplines of the Jesuits may all be variations of weft upon a single unsuspected woof. 12. These links are sometimes tenaciously clung to, even at the expense of general goodwill in the community. Local nobles continued support for the Cathars even when such action became anti-survival. The fraternal links of modern Freemasons are said to be supranational even when the host communities are at war. 13. The dogma, ritual or myth does not provide a true historical link with the origin of the movement. The historicity of Christian Rosenkreuz is regarded as untenable. Arthur of the Round Table, incompatible with any historical Arthur. The belief that the gypsies came from Egypt is untenable. Legends of historical incidents in which alchemical gold-making occurred are at one level veridical. At another, the historicity goes soft at the critical point. 14. There are distinct signs of actual or former mental and physical practices, such as exercises. The dancing of the witches, the whirling of some dervishes, the Freemason memorizing the work, a witch riding a broomstick, the psychological exercises of the Jesuits, maypole dancing, working through a maze at the end of a pilgrimage. 15. There is a connection with religion, but it is never official religion. The Arthurian literature is aspirational and devotional, but the precise nature of the religious content cannot be pinned down. Master builders of the cathedrals seem to have worked independently of official church policy, for example, gargoyles and the symbolism of the great cathedrals. 16. There is always a connection with non-religious behavior to such an extent that religious or mystical investigators become confused in trying to locate the association. Elements of art, science, literature, chemistry, commerce, military affairs intrude, but cannot be accommodated in formal labeling. The sexual components of the love courts, the sexual ambivalence of the Arthurian saga, the Baphomet legend in the Templar Order, the strains of science, chemistry and religion in alchemy, the martial elements in the orders of chivalry, the Hermetic Fair when a papal enthronement was played as black comedy actually within the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the Christian Feast of Fools and the Feast of the Donkey, all seemingly religious activity with a non-religious or anti-religious component that defies analysis. 17. It would appear that some force prevents, certainly at the time of their maximum operation, the coherent investigation of their location, operation, and other attributes which would make it possible to mount effective opposition. Witch covens and their procedures are endlessly reconstructed from testimony extracted from witches under torture, but coven meetings do not seem to have been raided in session. 18. They are always studied piecemeal, and an apparently inside explanation of their activities and nature is eagerly accepted. Activities of this sort are in turn regarded as heresies, later as psychological phenomena, and at the present time as the result of social and economic forces. The pigeonholing actually serves to aid concealment. Once labeled, there is no further public interest, the secret being now exposed. Official science accepted Jung's psychological explanation of alchemy with relief. A troublesome thorn in rationalist flesh, it had been identified and labeled and was therefore respectable. There was no further need to regard it as something that needed attention. 19. Apostasy. From such organizations contains the suspicion of diversionary tactics, dervish orders who went over to Genghis Khan, Mevlevis who agreed to put on a tourist pantomime for Kemal Ataturk. 20. The available literature of such organizations seems to disappear after a time, or is found in such a diversity of forms as to baffle inquiry. This peculiarity may suggest a deliberate policy of stirring up the pond to make the water muddy. The quantity of surviving alchemical texts is enormous, but the success in decoding is in inverse ratio to the amount of material included in any particular study. After only 70 years, it has apparently become impossible to unravel the origins of the neo-pagan society of the Golden Dawn. There are now probably as many authoritative final explanations as there are researchers. Documentation of seemingly equal validity is available to prove that it derived from a revelation to Henry Bergson's sister, and that it grew from a magical document lying on a book barrow in the Farringdon Road, London. Elucidation of Rudolf Steiner's source is no less interbulated. From external analysis, it seems impossible to arrive at any firm conclusion as to the theory of intervention. As to the object of such historical operations as have been suggested, it would appear impossible to discover the aims and purposes which they could have. If they are mounted to convert and organize masses of people, it seems clear that they have never succeeded. It is more likely, assuming that such activities take place, that the aim is to locate and act on selected people at various points in history and then to disband activity decisively. It seems possible to detect vestigial traces of some activity of the kind suggested. The quality of such activity seems consistently arid and banal and may suggest the mechanical perpetuation of some format from which the essential quality has been fully abstracted.